Within a subway system as immense as New York's, a few remarkable curiosities stand out. For example, there is a cavernous space beneath Delancey Street big enough to hold a 4-lane highway, leftovers from a subway expansion stalled by political fights a century ago. And there's also the hidden upper level at 42nd Street, completed, tiled and lit, yet sealed off before a single passenger ever set foot in it. Not to mention another abandoned platform at 91st Street, which was fully built but left behind when the line's geometry was reworked at last minute. Even so, none of these compare to the mystery beneath City Hall Park. You see, it's there that behind locked brass gates and sealed stairways lies one of the most beautiful stations in the entire system. An underground palace of sweeping vaults, glowing skylights, curved tracks, and ornamentation usually reserved for Renaissance libraries. And yet, this was the very station New York chose to abandon. So how could such a contradiction happen? Why would New York close off the architectural masterpiece meant to dignify its public? And why, despite its beauty and historical importance, is it still off limits to the public today? Stay tuned to find out as we discover the story behind New York's greatest subway station and why it's completely abandoned. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. At the turn of the 20th century, New York City stood on the brink of transformation. Its streets were already overflowing, and the rumbling elevated trains were proving to be too much of a nuisance. And since the population had doubled within a single generation, every expert agreed that the city had reached its breaking point. Hence, Manhattan needed a modern rapid transit system, something capable of moving people but without taking up more surface space. In other words, the only option was to go underground. And the quest wouldn't be easy. Early proposals for a subway were tangled in political disputes, engineering skepticism, and fierce arguments over who would control the line once it was built. Furthermore, some engineers insisted that underground construction beneath lower Manhattan's soft soil would be impossible, whereas others argued that tunneling under City Hall Park, in particular, would destabilize the post office vaults and foundations of the municipal buildings above. Regardless, the population was growing fast, and so the government had to act. So by the 1890s, the city committed to building a unified underground route from the Bronx to lower Manhattan. This system would become the first line of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, or the IRT. And then, as the routing plan solidified, a symbolic question emerged. Where should the subway even begin? For leaders, the answer wasn't exactly logical, rather, it was symbolic. They believed that since New Yorkers were wary of descending underground, the new subway needed a ceremonial gateway that could inspire trust as well as dignity. With that in mind, a station near City Hall, at the core of government, offered the perfect solution. Still, and this is important, the choice came with abundant complications. For starters, to carve the tunnels, the city had to negotiate rights with the federal government, whose post office facilities stood directly in the path of the proposed line. From there, engineers had to reroute utilities, reinforce unstable soil, and design a tight loop to turn trains efficiently without disturbing surrounding foundations. This was a bureaucratic mess. Every element required approval, compromise, and new techniques, but the will to build the subway was strong enough to push everything forward regardless. By the early 1900s, the challenges of tunneling under City Hall Park were finally resolved, and crews pushed ahead with constructing the station that city leaders hoped would redefine what public infrastructure could be. As things moved ahead, the New York Tribune described, quote, an immense excavation beneath the park, noting, quote, a web of timber braces and arch forms that signaled something far more ornate than an ordinary transit stop. Now, hidden within that work was a detail that most New Yorkers never learned. The station was actually built with a second exit at its southern end, fully tiled, fully fitted, and ready for public use. But because it opened too close to sensitive buildings, the entrance was deemed a liability almost immediately. And with that, before the first passenger ever arrived, the staircase was bricked over, leaving a finished but inaccessible portal sealed beneath the park. Anyhow, with the basics intact, Raphael Guastavino's craftsmen began laying their signature tile vaulting, though these vaults weren't just chosen for beauty. According to engineering reports, City Hall was also experimenting with sound dampening, since the thin tile system was meant to soften the harsh echoes expected in an underground station, making City Hall one of the earliest attempts to engineer acoustic comfort within mass transit. But don't get me wrong, many things were just for decoration. Chandeliers of custom-cast bronze were installed, although during the day, natural light was also available, as skylights were fitted across the platform in warm, golden patterns. Archived photographs reveal just how bright those skylights once were. That is, before the soot and city dust ultimately dulled their surfaces. For a time, sunlight poured directly into the station, illuminating the entire curve with a soft glow that early reporters described as, quote, daylight underground. Moreover, oak furnishings were chosen to match the palette of City Hall above. Even the fare control railings were fitted with decorative metalwork. So, indeed, the city kept its early promise that the subway would be, quote, a dignified experience. When construction finally wrapped up in fall of 1904, the New York Herald marveled at the, quote, cathedral-like vaults and rich color harmonies, declaring the City Hall loop, quote, the most beautiful station in the country. That's right, the station itself was a showpiece. In fact, before it even opened, the IRT hosted exclusive so-called handcar tours for the women of society who were invited to experience the elegance of the terminal ahead of the city at large. These early tours were essentially a publicity campaign, proof that the City Hall station served a psychological purpose as much as a practical one. But 4 days after those exclusive tours, on October the 27th, 1904, the subway officially opened the station to the public. Mayor George McCallum famously took the controls of the first train, driving it from City Hall up to 145th Street as cheering crowds pressed along the platforms. It was also noted that guests who entered the platform that evening encountered a space unlike anything before it in American transportation, curved, glowing, and soft echoes beneath a vaulted ceiling. And it's also interesting to consider that City Hall Loop was not the only terminal loop envisioned at the time. Early maps published in 1902 showed plans for several looping terminals across Manhattan, part of a design philosophy that favored continuous train movement over end-of-line turnarounds. And so, the City Hall stop simply became the most fully realized example of this early approach. Be that as it may, almost immediately, problems emerged. According to the Times in early 1905, the nearby Brooklyn Bridge station was recording staggering traffic, far beyond what planners projected. That article also featured a map of the Brooklyn Bridge station, claiming it was poised to become the busiest point in the entire line, meaning City Hall's ceremonial role was already at odds with the system's practical needs. And with thousands of commuters pouring across every hour, the Brooklyn Bridge IRT stop indeed became the gravitational center of lower Manhattan transit. And basically everyone started to notice that the City Hall station was practically bypassed. Despite the fact that the station sat only a few hundred feet from the glamorous loop, and the reasoning here is simple. Riders simply chose convenience. Apparently, they didn't really need those oak benches. From the Brooklyn Bridge, they could transfer to surface trolleys, catch elevated lines, or continue their trip deeper into Manhattan without needing to set foot on that beautifully curved platform. This shift began raising questions about the loop's necessity at all, to the point that a Times article noted how engineers were already discussing the terminal's fate once express service would be expanded. Now, you might remember from previous videos that New York could never really make its trains wider, so they had to go longer, all the way up to 8 cars at the first set, but then ultimately 10, and the tight curve of City Hall meant that the cars in the middle of the train would be positioned too far from the platform's edge, posing an unacceptable safety hazard. And just like that, the loop, which had seemed so elegant in concept, was proving to be out of sync with reality. By the late 1910s, as additional lines opened and ridership skyrocketed, the problem only intensified. This was best illustrated by an article from August of 1918, which showed that the city was struggling to keep pace with the swelling population, and stations like Brooklyn Bridge, which were bigger, straighter, and more connected, were absorbing the overwhelming majority of passengers south of Canal Street. In the meantime, City Hall, with its 5-car platform, was refined, yes, but it was already slipping into complete irrelevance. Still, no politician wanted to announce its closure since it was basically created as a civic gesture. Hence, for a time it did remain open to avoid bad optics, though locals rarely caught a train there. Though there was fanfare, as even in the early 20th century, tourists and architecture enthusiasts praised it. And all throughout, journalists continued to call it the jewel of the system. But to the IRT, the station's beauty couldn't really justify its functional shortcomings. Intuitively, everyone knew what had to be done, and although no one really wanted to face it, by the mid-1940s, the decision was made to close the station forever. On December 31st, 1945, City Hall Station closed its doors for the very last time. Authorities publicly justified the decision by citing low ridership and the cost of retrofitting the curved platform for longer trains. But the internal memos, as reported by the Times, were even more blunt. They read that maintaining a ceremonial station for only a handful of daily riders made zero operational sense. So, from that night onward, all Downtown 6 trains stopped at the Brooklyn Bridge and then rolled through the empty loop, gliding past the dark arches where the chandeliers were switched off. Within months, dust began to settle on the oak benches, the skylights were covered in city grime, and without regular maintenance, water started to seep through the vaults, leaving mineral streaks across the tiles. During the Second World War, and in an already weathered state, the station had briefly taken on a different role, as the loop's geometry and secluded location made it useful as a secure turnaround point for trains evacuating Lower Manhattan during civil defense drills. But other than the drills, after 1945, its significance faded once again. It wouldn't be until the nostalgia boom of the 1950s, when rail fans began publishing photos of long-lost stations, that the public rediscovered City Hall's existence. And then the topic went mainstream, when photographs appeared in publications during the 1970s. Preservationists called the loop a masterpiece and urged the city to reopen it as a part of a future transit system. However, the MTA had other concerns. Internal reports noted that the station's vaults required special inspections due to water leakage, and that sections of the mezzanine were structurally fragile after decades of dampness. And on top of all that, its entrance lied directly beside City Hall, creating an immediate modern security concern. Even so, by the 1990s, further interest led the Transit Museum to draft a proposal to restore the station for public tours. The Daily News reported in 1999 that nearly $2 million in stabilization work had already been completed in anticipation, but that City Hall's security office still objected. Remember, the station is directly beneath several sensitive municipal offices, and so reopening it, even to small guided groups, was deemed way too dangerous. Though surprisingly, there was a brief moment when the public was welcomed back. In October of 2004, which was the subway's 100th anniversary, the city reopened the City Hall station for a single day. Reportedly, visitors were able to descend the old stairway, marvel at the intact chandeliers, shimmering tilework, and curved loop illuminated by soft bulbs. This was a rare glimpse of the subway's original promise: beauty, dignity, and civic pride. After that celebration, the gates closed once more, and today, the only way to see it is to stay on the 6 train as it turns through the loop. But remember, the chandeliers are switched off, so you won't see much. In a way, it's sad that this station's been abandoned. Still, given the state of public subway platforms throughout New York, it might be for the best, since at least this way, New York has accidentally created a priceless time capsule to a bygone time, and it's one worth remembering. It's also one that makes me wonder what else is down there. If you know about some more New York secrets, let me know in the comment section below, and maybe I'll make your video. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.